Well, thank you, Shane, for this great opportunity. It's been my great privilege to be friends with Shane for a while now. I've actually been on his radio show a couple times. Sorry if you were listening during those hours. No, actually, I think we had a pretty good time of that. And I've been here before as well, and talked with some of you before. If you've seen or talked or heard me speak before, raise your hand. Okay. All right. I get a sense of. Hopefully I won't bore too many people and repeat too many things. There's things that I'm very, very passionate about. And I will just say thank you. It was Coulter, right? Thank you so much. I was moved by his speech. When he talked about the Declaration of Independence in particular, that is a great treasure that we have. There's something remarkable and special there. I would even call it divine. This concept of who we are and where our rights come from, and that they can't be taken away, and that they're ours by divine design. And that is really a sacred thing if you think about it. It was Abraham Lincoln, actually. We just heard tonight there appears to be some discrepancy in some ways between the Constitution and some of the things said in the Declaration of Independence. And quite frankly, from my reading of history, many founders would have acknowledged that. There were some compromises that went into that Constitution. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, in his efforts to abolish slavery, often referred to the Declaration of Independence. In fact, any of you familiar with the Bible, he used the analogy that's spoken of in Proverbs, speaking of apples of gold in frames of silver. I don't know if you remember this, but speaking of the Declaration of Independence as being the apples of gold and the Constitution being the frame of silver, that really the goal of what we were talking about, what we were working towards, was embodied there in that declaration. It's really it's got to be my favorite document because it does remind us who we are and what the purpose of government is and where government gets its powers and who it's accountable to. And so it's a fantastic thing. This country is so blessed. I think about what he said, that he's an American. And I hope we all feel proud to be Americans. We have truly a special and precious heritage as such. Now, I wanted to talk, there's so much I could talk about as far as principles go, and I was listening tonight about the discussion, and I liked Shane's comments as well, that it's easy to be a naysayer. There's so many things that are not the way they should be. It's true. It's true. There's so many things that need to change. And I hear the consensus, and maybe there's a little bit of disagreement here or there, but the general idea is, wouldn't it be nice to have rule of law, that law, supreme law of the land being the Constitution? Isn't that what everyone who's elected takes an oath to? It's a remarkable thing, isn't it? It's remarkable that we still perform that ceremony of swearing in, where we take that oath, and yet it seems so few either understand it or care about it. And I find that amazing. But you see, I'm one like you. I'm very passionate about the principles. I believe in those things. And so what I wanted to do tonight is to bring some hope. So to bring some hope and give you some examples of some successes we've had and that we can have, and to talk to you about lessons learned that I've learned as a principled conservative, someone with that goal of restoring constitutional government, of restoring our republic as it was intended. There's some very important lessons. So again, I'm still new. I've been on the council for 4 years. And quite frankly, I'm used to being kind of that odd man out. I know what that feels like. That guy in the corner that sort of feels a little bit like no one can hear what he's saying, but he's very passionate. In fact, I was the dark horse candidate. When I first ran, I was the only council member to win that race who was endorsed by neither newspaper. Now, I know in this room I'll probably get applause for that. But just so you know, that wasn't necessarily all that helpful for me at the time. It was a challenge. Okay? So that gives you a sense of where I come from. Now, right off the bat, after I got elected, I was definitely making waves. Okay? In fact, quoting the Constitution, quoting founders. I even had a council member. I hate to say that there are certain council members that I'm under their skin, but this particular council member, I'm definitely under this person's skin. And I was pulled aside after a meeting once and told, I can't believe you. You quote the founders more than you do Scripture. What? That was a baffling comment to me because I thought, well, do you want me to quote Scripture from the dais? Is that where I should do that on TV? I mean, I don't mind doing that at some level, but it was just an interesting comment. But you can kind of see where I come from. And in fact, I felt very marginalized, even my first few years on the council. I know what that feels like. If you wanted to add up all of the times that I had voted in the minority, in other words, I had been outvoted, and then you took all the other council members, the number of times they had been outvoted, summed them up, combined, I would probably still have been outvoted more than all the rest of them combined. Okay? I know what this feels like. Okay? So I want to give you that context to help you understand that we can feel like we're not being effective. But oftentimes, we don't realize how effective we are, number one. And number two, we can learn some lessons to help be more effective. So I wanted to talk tonight about what those lessons were. Now, I didn't come into this, come onto this stage of politics without any strengths. I mean, I had some. And one I want to point out, and is really important, okay? And Shane talked about this. We don't want to be naysayers. We want to be positive. We don't want to just talk about what's wrong. We want to have the right answer. And we want to advocate for it in a positive, exciting way so people understand it and want to engage into it. Well, if we're going to be effective in persuading and working with others, we need to learn to be meek. Who knows what meek is? If you read the Bible, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Bible. Well, that's a promise. That's a promise, thank you. Inherit the earth. That's a promise given to the meek, right? But now there's different, let me just tell you, there are different definitions of this word. But let me tell you the one that's been most meaningful for me in politics. This is important. Meekness is enduring injury with patience and without resentment. Okay, now that doesn't mean somebody says something's true and you just lie down and don't say what's true. But what it means is you don't take it personally. What it means is you forgive. What it means is you turn the other cheek. What it means is you love your enemies. Okay? And you stay focused on the issue and not on what's personal and petty and your ego and your feelings. You focus on the issue and you hold that thing up high and you take that principle and you put it on a stick for everyone to see, and you don't care what arrows they're shooting at you personally. That's just noise. See what I'm saying? That is an important characteristic we have to take into ourselves if we're going to be effective. If we want people to rally to us and our message, we need to be loving and kind to people. We may not agree with them. That's fine. You don't have to agree. Don't give up the principle. But be kind to the person you disagree with. Maybe you serve them. Maybe you mow their lawn or something. I don't know. But these are important things to learn. So that's the one thing I will say is a strength I've brought onto the stage with this. Something I still work on. Don't get me wrong. I get my feelings hurt. Sometimes I want to be personal too. But I'll tell you that has served me well. And that's something we need more of in politics. And the way I like to talk about it is we need to focus more on what's right than who's right. That's the focus. Now, my weakness is on the flip side of this, and this gets into the lessons I've learned. My weakness is in thinking everyone thinks like that, or that even I think like that all the time. Unfortunately, the personal and the petty and the emotion and all that stuff is so much a part of politics. So we have to learn to be as wise as serpents and yet as harmless as doves, right? That's what we want. So let me tell you some things I've learned. Now, first of all, I'm going to put this in context of a victory that we had. Well, I consider a victory. It's a victory for the Second Amendment. And if you care about the Second Amendment, I think you'll agree with me that it was a victory. But we as a town of Gilbert, and this is like pretty much every other town that I know of, maybe there's some changes, I don't know. But basically, we have gun-free zones. Now, there are different kinds of gun-free zones. There's the kind of gun-free zone where you go to court and there's metal detectors and security guards, and guess what? You're pretty sure nobody's got a gun, okay? That's different. I'm talking about we have a sign on the wall that says, don't bring a gun in here, okay? And there is no enforcement. And so what I called that, and I hope I can coin this and people start talking about it this way, but that is an honor system gun-free zone. That's what that is. And let me ask you, If you have an honor system gun-free zone, who are you disarming? The honorable. Okay. So, and how does that make us safer? Who can name for me a major massacre that we've seen in the newspaper that did not occur in an honor system gun-free zone? Columbine. Oh, that was a gun-free zone. I mean, you can go down the list. That theater, there was 2 college ones I can think of. There was one in even Phoenix College. You go down the list, I can't even think of one that didn't happen in an honor system gun-free zone. In my opinion, that is the least safe place on the planet, and frankly. So this issue came up, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we got to talk about. Well, I'll just tell you, the state legislature, who gets a hard time about being too conservative on some things, they are very pro-Second Amendment. And thanks to them, this actually ended up on our plate. But I'll get into more detail on that. So I want you to see how this worked, though. We flipped this thing around. When I first fought on this issue and tried to abolish this silly policy, I got outvoted 4-2. 4-2. In August of 2013, we got outvoted 4-2. Now, who was the other guy? Who's heard of the Taylor family that runs Heritage Academy? Okay, they're here in Mesa. Yeah, they actually believe in the Constitution. I know, crazy. So he was with me, but we were outvoted 4-2. A little over a year later, in December 2014, who wants to guess what the vote was? Obviously, you know I won. But what do you think the vote was? These are all the same individuals, okay? We didn't have any change of election yet. No. Nope. Even better. 6-1. By the way, there was a council member absent. That's why it doesn't add up to 7. Council member Ray was out of town. So he was back in town. We went from a 4-2 loss to a 6-1 victory in a little over a year on the same issue. I want to talk to you about how we did that. There's some very important lessons learned here. All right. So I'm gonna try and make this all get lessons learned alongside of recounting the story. I'll try and make it mesh, but if it's a little disjointed, be patient with me. But let me tell you what the first lesson learned is. And I've already heard this tonight. I feel so at home. I got to tell you that. So many things I heard were already in here when what I was saying. But let me give you a little news flash. The bureaucracy has power. Does everybody know this? Did you know, there's some people who've, I think, been in the thick of this enough. There was a guy who wrote a book called Shadow Warriors. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But some people will say the bureaucracy is the 4th branch of government. And boy, you better believe there's a major influence there. Now, this is something I thought I knew, but I didn't really know it like I needed to know it. Let me give you one example of how pervasive this thinking is to go along with staff. Now, keep in mind, the staff members, this isn't a bad thing. If you work for government, I'm not trying to diss all government work. It's not like it's wrong or it's bad. But, well, I'll give you the story. I had a council member angry with me after a meeting, and these were the words that I heard yelling at me. You don't represent staff at all. And I kind of scratched my head, and I said, well, I'm here to represent the taxpayer, well, the citizen, whatever you want to say. I'm here to represent, everybody. And the reply was, well, they're taxpayers too. So I didn't want to get into a big battle there. This council member is probably the most influential council member on our council. And that's the thinking that's going on. I'm bad because I don't represent staff. Well, if I'm supposed to represent staff, why do we need to be here? Because they can represent themselves perfectly without us. Let me tell you, we're just in the way. But so that's how pervasive that thinking is to have someone that angry with me. But I also thought about this. I mean, yeah, staff, and I've done the math, less than 1% of our taxpayers are staff. The other 99%, guess what? They pay their salaries. Let's don't forget, it's not that it's bad to be staff, but when you're talking about keeping tax dollars in your pocket, sometimes there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there with those who are receiving those tax dollars. Just saying. So you talk about trying to shrink government. Who's going to vote to shrink their own department? There's trouble there. All right. So staff opposed me. The point here with this case is staff opposed me from day one on this issue. It was kind of a head scratcher too because I couldn't quite understand why. Our town attorney, that's who writes our packets. We have little briefs that we get before meetings. So I'm not going to say they're telling you how to think, but they brief you on how what the information is. And of course, right there in the packet it says staff recommends, we continue this policy of gun-free zones. So I was already, behind the 8 ball there. And then when we had the meeting, our police chief stands up and opposes me as well. That was another head scratcher. I was a little bit surprised at that. So I had a follow-up meeting with him. And by the way, this is a principle I'll talk about, but it's very important that we seek to understand before seeking to be understood. And so I sat down with him and I tried to understand, and I listened and I listened, and you know what it all boiled down to? He sincerely believed that it was a bigger risk to have the everyday law-abiding citizen with good intentions having weapons than he thought it was a threat for criminals having weapons. Well, I mean, look, in Gilbert, we have the second safest city in the country. There's probably very few criminals. So we're going to have a lot more guns around here, and who knows what's going to happen if the law-abiding citizens are carrying them, right? I mean, I guess. I don't know. That was his thinking. Obviously, I couldn't agree with that. So that was a lesson I learned, is the bureaucracy has power, and you better not forget it. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is procedures. Okay, now I don't know, any of you that want to get involved and have influence and be successful, you need to understand there's procedures. There's Robert's rules, for example. Okay, if something's going to become law, there's a process that it goes through. The more you know those details, you know the rules of the game, the better you can win it. Okay, so when I first got elected, I would often, on different issues, I'd be arguing, my arguments would be sound, and then I'd get a point of order or something. I'm not even sure they were always right, but they would just tie me up in procedures. Okay, we have to remember this. We need to know the rules of the game. Okay, and in fact, to get this item on the agenda, I have to thank the state legislature, because as a council member, this is something else you should know. You have a favorite council member that somehow doesn't seem to get things done. Guess what? He or she can't even get an item on the agenda by themselves. Did you know that? You have to get at least 2 other council members, 3 council members to agree to put it on the agenda. And let me tell you something else you'll learn. People are not always who they seem to be. I can't tell you. There have been some times some council members say in public, oh yeah, let's put that on the agenda. And then after the meeting, I get them to sign the card to put it on the agenda. Guess what? They say, no, I'm not going to do that. They're not always who they seem to be. Why don't they want to, though? Why do you think a public official doesn't want an item on the agenda? Go ahead. Exactly. Everyone knows what political doublespeak is, right? That's only possible so long as you don't take a very obvious, open, clear public position on an issue. As soon as you vote publicly, everyone knows what you're saying. You can't say one to one and a different to the other. You can't get away with that anymore. So the real true politicians who want to keep their seat more than they want to get something done that's right, they'll play that all day long. So it's hard to get items on the agenda, harder than you might think. And so anyway, I just should mention this. They did shove this item, though, on the consent agenda, and they painted it this way. We have to change our code to update it to be in compliance with state law. That's really all they said. We just have to comply with state law. Because the state law, you know what happened? Our pro-Second Amendment legislature, they said, wait a minute, if you guys are going to keep taking people's guns, you have to at least provide a secure place to store them. You can't have people walking back to their cars, putting their guns in their cars. Who knows what happens then? Somebody breaks in, takes their weapon, we got problems. Or maybe they walked there. How are they going to leave their weapon then? They're going to walk all the way home and take their gun. So the legislature, we had to change our, absolute ban on guns without any requirements. We had to throw that out and at least put in the requirement for lockers to be provided. Now, another frustrating thing is the staff had already installed the lockers. How do you like that? We didn't even ask for it. We hadn't even made a decision on what we were going to do. Keep in mind, we had the right to allow people to bring weapons in. We always had that right. But they just assumed we were going to go with the absolute minimum allowed by law and keeping people's, guns in lockers rather than keep them on their persons. So they had already made the expenditure. They had already installed the lockers. I had that going against me as well. Okay, I'm boring you with that detail, but procedures matter. And but we were able to pull it off consent. The consent calendar is where they shove all these items that they want you to think, at least, are not controversial. So we're going to vote on them. They might vote on like 20 items at once in one vote. So it was just buried in there. I pulled it out of there, and at least we got to discuss it. Here's another news flash. Another lesson learned. this was referred to tonight. The media are usually not on your side. Okay, I know, I should have known this more. But this is really important, guys, because those of us that are passionate about principles, we just want to talk about it. And we want it to be heard far and wide. You know what? And that's good. But there's also a way to be careful about it and what we say and how we say it. Again, we want a positive message that resonates with people, that they want to rally to. I will tell you this. It is at a politician's own hazard to ignore this principle. I have watched certain politicians, I won't name names, but I will just tell you I've seen pretty firsthand what happens when you ignore this rule and realize that you don't want to give bad ammunition to the media. They're not on your side. So you're going to say something, you want it to be clear, simple, and to have it resonate with the average person. Okay. That was an important thing to know because with this item, I actually got better. I'm the worst perpetrator. I talk way too much. I'm in the newspaper probably more than anybody. I'm sure Sandy can attest to that. I'm very passionate about these principles. But I'll tell you, I've learned some things. And one of the things I did was I used a word that resonated. When I won on this issue, a year and a few months later, I used a word called compromise. Oh, they love that. They love that. But you'll see it's appropriate. I know, people are freaking out. We'll get to this. All right. So keep that in mind. Another thing that I've learned through this process is that in debate, okay, first of all, we always want to be kind, patient, calm, clear. We want to be brief, simple, clear. We want to be brief, simple, and clear. You know, the best tactic for dodging an issue is to ramble off in some other direction. The more that you keep it simple, brief, to the point, the harder it is for others to do that. And plus, you get to control the message. Okay, what's reported, you get to control more. You keep things on point. Now, we were blessed on this issue because, and by the way, this is another one I've struggled to learn. But we were blessed on this issue because it's so straightforward. The right to bear arms is, at least in Arizona, resonates with so many people. I just kept hitting that point, quoting the Second Amendment, the right. You know, it's really profound the way it's written there. It's written, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The right of the people. Whose right is it? The people. It's yours. Okay? That's very clear. There's no denying whose right it is and that it is a right. All right. So I kept hammering that. And then we just go to the basic logic you guys are all familiar with. When guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. I mean, this is not complicated. Okay? And plus, I don't just have to go with logic. Look at the facts. Look at the data. Okay? Now, I know 87% of statistics are made up on the spot, which I just made that up, but I'm pretty sure I'm close. Somewhere in the 90%, 95% range of gun violence happens in the gun-free zones. That's where it all happens. So, okay, the statistics will win for us, and also simple, clear statements will win for us. All right. Now, I alluded to this previously, but I can't tell you how important this is. Now, and I don't know what it is about human nature, but sometimes we don't really like to listen too intently to the opposing view. It kind of makes us mad. You know what I'm saying? That's not a fun feeling to have somebody explain to you why you're wrong. But let me tell you something. We need to do that. In fact, I'll tell you what I've tried to do. I go out of my way to understand as clearly as possible the very best arguments on the other side. Now, there's two reasons to do this. Number one, if we care about what the truth is, we should never fear that. And what do you have to lose but your own ignorance, right? If perchance you've missed something, if perchance you've overlooked something, you want the right answer, don't you? So that's number one. But number two, let me tell you what happens usually. With a person like you and me, who's dedicated to the principles, we think things through, we're probably not going to be too surprised, and we're probably not going to have our viewpoint do a 180 through that conversation. But you know what we are going to have? Lots of ammunition. Because you're going to know what the argument is, and you're going to be able to diffuse it. Because you understand it completely, inside and out. You may understand their side of the argument better than they do. You can articulate it better than they do. which will also give you the power to diffuse it and rebut it. So, you know, this principle of seek to understand before seeking to be understood, it's an important one. And so that's why I mentioned, I sat down with the police chief. I talked with our town manager. Man, I tell you what, I talk more with staff than probably anybody. And I know most of them don't like me much. But I want to understand what they know, okay? They're the experts. They have information. Knowledge is power. So we need to go out of our way to seek that opposing view. All right. But I'll just mention, in this case, and it happens a lot, the more I listened, the more I became convinced that I was in the right position through this process. Now, the next lesson I learned is, it's so obvious, especially probably to moms, maybe anyone who's not a guy like me, I don't know, but relationships are important. Relationships are important. Okay, when I talked about we should care more about what's right than who's right, well, guess what? Loyalties to friendships, they matter. And I hate to admit it, but a lot of times things happen in politics, not because of what the issue is, but what the connections are and what the relationships are. If we fail to recognize this and understand this, we're going to be behind every time. Okay? So that's another reason why it's so important for us to have friendly relationships with those we disagree with. That may sound hard, but I mean, I don't know. I'm not claiming everyone here is a Christian necessarily, but anybody that is, at the very least, I mean, every religion has some kind of love thy neighbor profession to it. Everybody does. I think we should all learn to do that. Okay, it's hard though. Sometimes I just want to, just kidding. No, I don't want to hurt anyone. So in this particular instance, relationships were the whole reason this ever came back. Any of you that know Robert's Rules are probably wondering, how the heck did it end up coming back to the agenda, right? So if you're on the losing side of a vote, you cannot be one of the people to request to have it put back on the agenda. And there's good reason for that. You don't want to recycle the same old debates we've already settled, right? It's a waste of time. However, if you're on the prevailing side of the vote and you have second thoughts about it, you can be one to ask that it's revisited. Well, I had a council member that I had a good relationship with. I didn't agree with him all the time. And I talked with him. I couldn't persuade him to get it back on the agenda. But I knew somebody that he knew, a common friend of ours that he respected a lot in the state legislature. So I called this friend of mine in the legislature and started talking to him. Come to find out, he was livid. He was mad about this issue. He had been following it, and he agreed with me 100%. In fact, he was tempted to come visit our meeting and give us a talking to, which, of course, I would have welcomed. But it says a lot about this guy because he doesn't do that kind of thing. So I said, you know what? Could you do me a huge favor? This fellow council member, can you talk to him? I know he respects you. He'll listen to you. And guess what? He did. And so we got it back on the agenda. So keep in mind, relationships matter. They're important. Okay, now this is the one I know I heard some doubt on. Compromise. Oh my goodness, what is compromise? Okay, let me talk about this. Compromise. In my mind, and if you want to correct me later, please feel free. I'm never offended by people disagreeing. But I think there's two different kinds of compromise. There's one kind that we have to do. There's another kind we must never do. The one kind we must never do is compromise on principle. Let me tell you what that means. Well, we heard about that apple of gold framed in silver. That apple of gold is always going to be that apple of gold. And I'm going to keep pointing at it. And I'm going to keep saying that's where we're supposed to be. That is the principle, and that's where we should be going. It's like the North Star. I'm never going to lose sight of that North Star, okay? I don't compromise on that. Okay, that's how we don't compromise on principle. But let me tell you what we must do. There's a number of reasons why. We must compromise on policy. Not principle, but policy. Why? Well, number one, think about it. As failed human beings, we're never going to come up with a policy that exactly matches principle perfectly, because we're flawed. Okay, we can understand principles and ideas that are so much more perfect than we're able to come up with some practice to follow. It just happens, okay? Just to understand the concept of perfection is like, how do I understand that? I've never seen it. I don't see anyone acting that way. But anyway, so we want to hold up the principle and we want to keep it there. But we want to be willing to take steps in that direction There's going to be a step in that direction that gets us closer to it. Maybe that step isn't far enough. Maybe we keep in sight that we're not there yet. But it's not compromising principle to say, I can't get there all in one step. Let me give you a good analogy for this. This is important. As principled conservatives, we really struggle with incrementalism. It's hard. It's hard for us because we know what's right, and we're going to keep fighting for it. And we should. That's why we don't compromise on principle. But let's say the analogy is this. Ground floor is government according to the Constitution as it was originally written. We got constitutional minutes. We're not in the dark here, guys. We got records. We can figure out what this thing means. Give me a break. Anyway, so that's our goal. That's our goal. That's ground floor. And we're in the basement somewhere. We're way below that. And you know what? There's guys in Congress that are taking us further down in the basement, one step at a time. But do you see what I'm saying? One step at a time. You can boil a frog 1 degree at a time. You can't throw him in a boiling pot. He'll jump out. But you can get him there one step at a time. You know what? You know how we're going to get out of this thing? I hate to say this, guys. I hope they're really big steps. But it's probably going to be one step at a time. We have to be practical. Now, don't get me wrong. Anytime there's a proposal out there and it's going to take us further into the basement, we absolutely oppose it. Who's saying you wouldn't? Of course you would. We don't want to go the wrong direction. But if there's something that takes us in the right direction, even if it's a small step, by golly, we ought to support that. We ought to rally around that. You know what? We'll let people get real comfortable with that. And as soon as we can, we'll take another step in the right direction. So it is not compromising on principle to say, I need to get to the ground floor, and rather than take a flying leap and try and make it there in one shot, I'm going to take the stairs. Okay? We need to learn that. It's something I need to learn. But don't forget the principle. We keep that up always. We don't lose sight of that. Okay. Now, how did this apply in this case? Well, I did compromise on policy. For one thing, I found out where the boundary was that I could not go. I tried to just get a blanket allowance of people to carry their firearms. I tried and I failed. I failed. So I already knew what I could not do. So that was helpful. Sometimes you don't have that luxury of knowing exactly how far you can take it. How big a step can I take? Can I skip one step or 2 steps? You may not know. It's hard. But I knew. And so I listened very carefully to what the main concern was from the most influential person I could think of on that council. And here's what it was. You know, I'm concerned that if a police officer sees somebody with a weapon and they're acting suspiciously, I'm concerned that if we say people are allowed to bring their weapons in, he'll have no way to ask them to take their weapon out or ask them to leave or something else for acting suspiciously. Now, I thought about that. That's not necessarily even probable cause. It's maybe not a perfect thing she's asking for. Whoops. Shush. We have two females on our council, so you can't even figure out who it is. Shush. See how I'm not trying to pick fights? I don't like to pick fights. When it's time to support a candidate, you'll be sure I won't support this person. But anyway. All right. The point is, I had always said anyway, who can stop a bad guy with a gun but a good guy with a gun? That's the main concern I have. Okay? The NRA said that, simple statement. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So I said, okay, hold on. What if we say this? My compromise to you is to say, if you have an armed police officer, that armed police officer can ask you to surrender your weapon and put it in a locker. What if I do that? Think about it. At the very least, if that's the compromise and there's an armed police officer nearby, at least you're guaranteed one good guy with a gun nearby, right? We're not totally unprotected. So that was the compromise I offered. Now here's the good news. The big debate had been about whether or not we wanted to spend the $1 million a year for the additional security. That's what it would have cost to add metal detectors and security guards full time. Nobody wanted to spend the money. And staff didn't either. Staff who was opposing me. So staff wasn't really serious about enforcement. But see, what this compromise does is it puts it right back in their lap. Anytime they want to have an armed security guard on duty, guess what? They can get the guns out of there just like they wanted. But they won't. So for all intents and purposes, people are going to be able to defend themselves, which is their God-given right. I will say that. That is their God-given right. You have the right to life. You have the right to defend your life. And we shouldn't put you at a disadvantage to those who want to take it away from you. Thank you. All right, so the last lesson I wanted to talk about from this experience was the simple, old-fashioned American value of hard work. Persistence wins in the end. You know, whoever is the most passionate and most determined and will work the hardest, you know, how can you defeat somebody that won't give up? Think about that for a minute. How can you ever really defeat someone who won't give up? You really can't. And in this case, it's a beautiful thing. Persistence did win in the end. I guarantee you nobody outworked me on this issue. Those who opposed me, I don't know what they did, but I know that I stuck to it. I stuck to it. So, and I'll just mention this too. This is another point of hope. I hope I can give to you. First of all, you need to recognize the effect you've already had. And maybe that's why some of the numbers have dwindled a little bit. Because some people feel like we've arrived a little bit. I hope they don't think that. There's so much more to do. That's why we got to hold that principle up there. But you've changed the conversation. You've changed it. I can't tell you how much our packets, these briefs that we get, they're like written for me. It's weird, man. So I'm seeing quotes of founders. There are quotes of founders in my briefings now. In fact, one of our assistant town managers just left, and she left with an email quoting all these founders. She says, I learned more about the founders than I thought I'd ever know on any council. And then she quoted all these founders. How did that happen? I was one guy until Jared got elected 2 years after me. But for 2 years, I was the only one quoting founders. I got berated for it. So why did that resonate with her? What was it about that? See, what you don't realize is sometimes even when you're in the minority, but your voice is clear, it's true, it stands on its own. And it may not have immediate effect, but it sticks in people's mind. A thought, an idea, one that's coherent, it's a powerful thing. So, in fact, I will say there's so many items that really I end up leading the debate, leading the issue. Not because I'm in the majority, but because I've been patient and persistent, stuck to it. I'm not making enemies. It's not personal. You know, I go out of my way to tell people when I agree with them and to thank them for good things that they do, even if they're people I disagree with most of the time. And don't get me wrong, I'm a sinner. I'm fallen, and I have to repent all the time. I'm not trying to put myself up there as some great example. I'm just saying we can succeed if we keep at it, okay? We keep to the cause. Now that was really it for the Second Amendment. And what I would just report to you is now, if you are in the town hall and you want to keep your weapon, you have the legal right to do so, whereas you could not do before. And that is a great victory in my book. We have actually taken, thank you. We have taken what should be an obvious Second Amendment right and been able to step back. Now, we're still in the basement, okay? We got far to go, but we've taken one step in the right direction, and that's a great feeling. Just shows that it can be done. So with that, I've got other issues we can talk about. I'm going to kind of defer a little bit to Shane here on how he wants to handle the rest of the time. I've got economic development things we could talk about. I could teach some of the